Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second session of today. My name is Cristina. I'm one of the campaigns coordinators at SAW. SAW is the UK's trade union for architectural workers. My pronouns are she, her. I have brown hair, I'm wearing glasses, and a black top. Our session is titled Table Manners, and through the event, we'd like to engage in the reshaping of the table, questioning who is brought to the table, the notion of invisibility, and who that is defined in relation to in the context of the industry. And in that spirit of reshaping, I think the format will be slightly different from the previous roundtable. We are going to have 3 speakers who are going to talk for about 5 minutes each. And that's very much done deliberately to leave as much room as possible for everyone's input at the end. So it's less of a kind of audience speaker relationship as in the previous roundtable. We'd very much like to encourage you to engage with each other, respond to each other's questions and provocations. So in that sense, I'd like to invite you to join the table. As a backdrop of the session, actually we'll only have this running in the beginning because we have one of the speakers joining us online. We have 4 images played on a loop, which are, the first one is a picture of Andrew Walker in his wheelchair speaking to 2 students seated behind him. The second image are 4 colorful passport photos with faces cut out, leaving white squares. The third one that's on the screen right now was an image taken this morning of the accessible ramp at number 33 being removed. The following image is a cover of New Architects Movement report from 1975, the text reading, "Working for what?" and the illustration is workers protesting. The following one is an early SAW poster reading, "We are tired." The following image is an image of a collective note-taking at a SAW workshop. We have 6 Tarot-style cards laid out, each containing a title and a corresponding artwork. From the top left, each card reads The Healer, The Starborn, The Comic, The Eternal Child, The Sustainer, and The Destroyer. And finally, we have 15 hand-drawn postcards attached to a grid wall structure, each postcard containing a prompt for drawing your character and a sketch response from a participant. So we are joined today by Reham online, Maia and Jordan, who will be exploring the theme through the lens of the public, practice, and education. And I will do a quick introduction for each and then pass on to them. So starting with Reham, who is our first speaker. She is an architectural designer, educator, and researcher, currently working as an architecture design fellow at Cambridge University. She's also the Urban Room coordinator for Croydon Council's placemaking team, working on designing and delivering public participatory engagement programs, attempting to demystify, co-design, and inform future planning mechanisms and policies. Our second speaker is Maia Rollo. To my right, she is an architectural worker and elected co-chair of SAW Unite. SAW is a trade union representing architectural workers within Unite's construction sector, advocating for better pay, abolition of unpaid overtime, and collective workplace organizing. SAW also engages with university talks across the UK, equipping students with knowledge of their rights and the power of solidarity. Our third speaker will be Jordan Whitewood-Neal, who is an architectural researcher, designer, and educator, working at the intersections of architectural history, design pedagogy, disability, and spatial justice. His research has focused on the disabled history at the Architectural Association and the concept of reliability and the production of space through the lenses of crypt theory, moral philosophy, technology, and time. Jordan works as a researcher at the Quality of Life Foundation and currently leads a design think tank at the London School of Architecture. In 2022, he co-founded disability-led research collective DIS with James Zadka-Haas, exploring disability, storytelling, and the built environment. I'll now pass on to Reham, who is joining us online. If we could switch to her. Thank you.
I'm sorry I couldn't be with you guys today, but really excited to be part of the rest of this discussion. So I'll start with a bit of a self-description. My name is Reham, which is an Arabic name from my North African ethnic background. I'm visibly a woman of color with lighter skin. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a bit short with brown 3C coils, curly hair. So my background is in architecture and art therapy. And so as part of our discussion today, I'm really interested in better understanding the ways in which we've individually been socialized and conditioned to further silence parts of ourselves in the institutions and the tables where we are invited. Whether you call it imposter syndrome, masking, all that kind of anxiety that comes with being invited to these spaces, and all the acrobats that we have to constantly perform to fit in. I'm curious about this phenomenon's power in reinforcing hegemonic table manners, even and especially when marginalized people are invited in and supposedly represented. So amidst all this policing, something very violent happens. We end up diluting and sanitizing our dreams and our future imagination to a point where we no longer actually recognize them. So I think this is kind of getting into the realm of talking about how, a little bit of identity politics and how we kind of, which parts of ourselves we speak from and enter a conversation through. And I think like our characters and politicized identities are complex. They're multi-layered, they're situational and often intersectional. And so a simple question of who are you in a context where we're having to navigate such increasing structural and systemic violence is often not enough to produce imaginings and future that we so direly need to arrive at. I believe that these imaginings and futures are ready. They're fully conceptualized and ready in our collective psyche, but need an invitation in as well as our kind of more surface identities. And so the challenge is, how do we not only invite our surface socialized and acceptable selves, but more explicitly and intentionally invoke our invisibilized self parts and voices? So the angry, the radical, the grieving, the expansive dreamer, the agitator, all those qualities and self voices that are immediately hunted as being too much or reduced or demonized as a whole. One way I'm currently exploring in invoking those parts of us within a public engagement setup, like the urban room, and sometimes even in the classroom and in studio with students as well, is leaning into the realm of play and gamification of decision making. So in the urban room, for example, we have a game where we invite public and participants to enter a visioning table of some sort. First, asking them by first asking them who they are. So who would you like to enter this conversation as? Is it kind of you as a local resident? Are you a local artist? Are you, just the kind of more surface and more basic kind of components of ourselves? But then we also ask to layer our characters. So if this is the first layer, so you're coming in as a local resident, what's another layer that you'd like to bring in? Is it, for example, you could be a local resident who is a mother. And so there's a specific need and desire that you are speaking from that is not fully seen and actualized in the spaces around you or in this particular challenge. And so the third layer is a little bit more abstract, and we're leaning into something that's referred to as archetypes. That's often used it's derived from Jungian psychology and often used in art therapeutic practices that help invoke different selves and energies that we speak from. So that could be a whole other layer. So you're a local resident who's a mother, and I don't know if you can see the sort of tarot cards that I've put as part of the presentation up, but you could pick any of them. So for example, on that day, you might be particularly drawn to the healer archetype as part of that layering. Another day, it could be the destroyer which has another message to give. And these archetypes in this kind of framework they're not kind of either negative or positive. They're kind of collective, universal archetypes that are available for all of us to lean into to help us invoke those deeper embedded messages and voices and things that we have to say that are unsaid otherwise. And so this kind of play and gamification, gradually, hopefully unpeeling the layers of our characters and what we really want to say, can create a safer and more open space to speak from those self parts and hopefully yield more creative and liberating possibilities. I would love to kind of expand on this a little bit more, maybe along with other speakers as well. But my provocation that I'm leaving with everyone today is, which self parts do you often find yourself leaving behind at the door before taking a seat at the table? What table manners and conditions do you imagine would make those parts feel more welcome and heard? Thank you.
Thank you, Reham. We'll now pass on to Maia.
Thank you both. Can you hear me okay? Is this microphone? So just to give you a description of myself before I start, my name's Maia. I'm a white female with brown hair, brown curly hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a black and white top. So I'm here to talk to you today in my position as the elected co-chair of SAW, the union, and I'm also, as Cristina said, an architectural worker in architectural practice, private practice, and I also have a couple of roles in architectural education as well for the Accelerate programme with Open City and at the University of Nottingham. So in SAW, our work comprises of an invisible and collective labour. We organise for a fairer and more just sector for all workers from behind the scenes. And this work is often in stark contrast to the role of the architect as a figurehead whose practices are often named after themselves and themselves only. And this naming of the practice sort of completely disregards the work done by often hundreds of people working above and beyond their positions in the frequently exploitative production of architecture. These characters who are in charge are often awarded and lauded by an architectural establishment on the efforts of the unacknowledged collective labour. So these characters, figureheads, these bosses are often overrepresented in spaces such as these, where they can be part of the discussion, imagining the future of the profession and participate in these conversations. And they can often able to take these opportunities as unpaid, as not all of their hours are billable, and their time is often much more flexible. And they are able to conduct this work and take up this space because workers can carry on making sure everything is happening in the background. For architectural workers to take up space in these places is a lot harder when they're consumed by the relentless monotony of work, especially as they would have to maybe take leave to be able to contribute and may not be fairly remunerated for their time. But in SAW, we see our invisibility and our anonymity as a positive and empowering position. We operate collectively as members with democratically elected positions. Therefore, we don't rely on certain personalities or individuals to function and for the success of our work, and this can ensure longevity within the movement. One of the ways in which we organise in our workplaces is to identify some of the roles that people inhibit and how best to utilise these. If anyone is at the table, or maybe we can pass some of these back, there's some pieces of paper with a game on it that we sometimes use. So we play this game and we identify roles and we test scenarios to work out how we can utilise roles within the workplace to mobilise each other and to influence power. And what's important about these roles and characters is that they're not necessarily individual people. Each office has these roles, and as people move on and move around, they may be filled and taken up by other people. And so the success of organising relies on all these roles and characters working together to readdress existing power structures. and there is power in our invisibility. So we want to imagine a future in which architectural practice is not as binary, where these power dynamics between bosses and workers are not as stark and as top-down. We want to work in places where workers have agency over the work they produce and have meaningful time to contribute to discourse about the profession. And we'd like to see less upholding of the figurehead position of the architect and of their calling. But it's important to note within this that we don't see architectural bosses or figureheads as bad people. They're just people who are acting out their role, which the architectural establishment reinforces. And these are not new issues or dynamics. They've been prevalent in the profession for a long time. In the 1970s, there was a movement, the New Architecture Movement, NAM, who organized and campaigned around this dynamic. And there was an image on the slide that might come through. And this is so entrenched within a class system that we live in, within our psyche. We need to rethink about how we see ourselves and how we understand our agency and how we hold the collective power to change it. So I wanted to end on a provocation, that how can workers dream of a future while they're trapped in the hypnotic exhaustion of overwork? Thank you.
Thank you, Maia. And that leads us on to Jordan.
Hello, so my name is Jordan Whitewood-Neal. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a young white man, fairly young, with short brown hair, and I'm sitting in a wheelchair, and I'm wearing an orange jacket and a green jumper. So my set of reflections revolves around two texts, which cut across themes of erasure, institutional responsibility, crip and disabled histories, and the necessity of certain futures within educational institutions. In Tina M. Camp's Listening to Images, in which she engages with lost archives of historically dismissed photographs of Black subjects taken throughout the Black diaspora, such as passport and other identification photos. She argues that images, like voices, are never truly silent. Their story is never invisible. Instead, she argues for their framing as quiet. Quote, quiet as an undervalued lower range of quotidian audibility. By quiet and quotidian, she suggests that, quote, they name practices that are pervasive and ever-present, yet occluded by their seeming absence or erasure in repetition, routine, or internalization, unquote. It was this idea of a seeming absence, the perception that one is not at the table, that brought me back to past and ongoing research into Andrew Walker, who was a former disabled tutor at the AA. One of the very few available images, which we'll see on this screen, of Andrew in the AA archive, to me is itself a quiet image. Tina Camp says, and quote, quiet regs sonically as a level of intensity that requires focused attention, unquote. To me, disabled histories require this listening, this attention, by those who can resonate it. In disabled and crip communities, we stretch across the spectrum from the quotidian, the everyday, to the hypervisible, made hypervisible either by the multitude of interactions institutionally constructed to facilitate our agency. I had 10 people helping me into the building earlier today. All the way through to being held up as markers of diversity. To sit at a table is not the same as being displayed upon it. The table as metaphor, as reality or imagination, is bound in questions of both etiquette that must be subverted and ethics of responsibility which must be restructured. In her book, Crip Space Time, Margaret Price asks, quote, what exactly does responsibility mean in the space of an academic institution, end quote. But in broader terms, what forms of moral responsibility is architecture and its institutional frameworks imbued with? And how do questions of invisibility, ignorance, and social beliefs inform our ethical approach towards disabled bodies? Crip historiographies and epistemologies and their relation to established systems of moral responsibility highlight a failing practice of ethics within the production and augmentation of space. Disability itself has a strong grounding in questions of ethics related to themes such as death, eugenics, technology, and cure. but its philosophical relation to questions of space remains underexplored. Our ingrained and familiar beliefs, to reference Descartes, about what space can provide or negate needs reimagining. We can think of disability in the same way as Bruno Latour called missing masses, body minds relegated to standardized, mechanized issues of technological rather than moral responsibility, where neither the social or the spatial provide the very basics of labor and support to disabled people, subverting the moral responsibility to care for one another. Institutions as site of material and social labor need to acknowledge this moral responsibility. So to finish on one final provocation, we can return again to Tina Campt in asking, what is the tense of a Black feminist future? Was one of the main questions within the book. And she concludes that it is that which will have had to happen, a necessitated future. The presentness and the immediacy of much institutional action fails to look back at what has been, but now may not be, and ahead at that which could be, or will have had to have been. So how can quiet actors, those who constantly inhabit multiple social times, facilitate and create active dialogue about our futures?
Thank you, Jordan. Okay, so just quickly repeat some of the provocations and then we can open it up for conversation. So we started off with the themes of public practice and education, and I think now we can add a layer of, in the same order, of the character, collective, and futures. So Reham explored the notion of professional splitting and the power of being allowed to embody a character or an archetype, and her provocation to us was, which part of yourself do you leave behind at the door before taking a seat at the table? And what table manners and conditions do you imagine would make those parts feel more welcome and heard? Maia, following on from the theme of character, spoke of inhabiting a character in the context of workplace organizing and of the two notions of the invisible, that which comes from being part of an anonymized collective, and that of carrying out mundane, necessary tasks in a practice as invisible labor. And her provocation was, how can workers dream while being trapped in the hypnotic exhaustion of overwork, with dreaming here as an act of protest in the present? Jordan spoke of the invisible as not silent but quiet, as not absent but obscured, and brought in this dimension of time, and that of which has to happen for the future to take place. And his provocation was, how can the quiet actors, those who constantly inhabit multiple social times, facilitate and create active dialogue about futures? Do we have any first questions, perhaps, from the audience to kick it off? Everyone's a lot shyer than this morning.
I can go. Thanks, everyone. Love that. I think it's really interesting just thinking about actually the reluctance of, like, firstly, there is a table, there are all these tools, there is this intent to say, to make it accessible, and we're listening to these words, and yet here we are still kind of like, I don't know if I'm the right person to talk. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to sit here. I think it's really interesting that in real time, we're witnessing that unfold. And so I think it's super brave, and I think it's really interesting what Reham was saying maybe about, like, which version of ourselves do we choose to bring? Yeah, and I guess just as a PhD, I'm a baby first year, and it's kind of, we were talking about imposter syndrome and kind of like, am I smart enough? Am I capable enough? So I think this is just a really nice space, and those were my first thoughts. Blech, you know? Please opine.
Yeah, I was wondering, could we have Reham on the screen again? Yeah, is that possible? So she can join in the conversation.
I'm not sure. I can see you.
Yes, we can hear you. You're in the room. However way you chose to present yourself, whichever character you'd like to embody.
I love the blur. We talk a lot about these kind of Mises moment of thoughts. Just, like you've got to start somewhere, and just welcoming this.
Yeah, I guess it's from what you said, is the kind of notion of the archetype and the character not necessarily having a moral dimension attached to it, but in the same time being something that you choose to embody, but also defined of the collective. I think the examples that Reham had, the kind of tarot style cards, the comic, I guess if we were to be dealt that and wanting to inhabit the comic, we would do it in a way in which we think is collectively understood that we should be behaving. And there's a question about whether, I guess, even turning up to this room, do we show up in a certain way? I know I do. I think I'm trying to be maybe more professional than I would normally be. And then is that in the way in which is collectively understood to be professional? Any other thoughts from the audience? Perhaps because it's after lunch? Everyone's...
I can go. This came up earlier when you were all presenting in the morning, and I was reminded when Reham was speaking earlier. In the project about elves, there was a kind of characterization which was creating a sort of anonymity, but also a collectivity which was empowering. Right, it was sort of vital to that community to have that voice and that character, which I found really interesting when contrasted to Megan, to your research, where the characterization of the patients, for example, throughout history or within Ireland, as a kind of homogenized group, from the outside at least, and maybe even from the inside, it almost has the opposite effect, where that anonymity kind of disempowers them. And I was just really interested about the tension, the contrast between those two examples. I didn't know whether you wanted to expand upon that at all. Sorry, I'm throwing it back to your presentation now.
No, that's very interesting how you actually, how you put this. And I think, because it's a very subtle thing, I think, to create such a character. You really have to know the community so well for it to have a positive effect, actually. Because in this case, it was people that were working for municipality that created the character. So they were not the people themselves that created the character. But that's maybe my thoughts about this. Is really like a very slippery slope. Also, I think, for example, in education, like how to use fiction in a way that makes sense and empowers actually people you talk about. I think that's also why sort of these situated approaches are become so important. Some thoughts on this. Megan is making notes.
I always make notes. That's not fair. So I've been thinking about that as well. It's actually a conversation that myself and Saoirse and Paolo were having about elves a few days ago. And where does that character emerge? And my note I've written down here is ownership. So the wider focus of my own research actually tracks the diagnosis or identity of autism in Ireland in the 20th century. And I move through different labels, through spaces. And I look at ideas of conception of disability, mental illness, post-disability, and how do assumptions play out in real time. So labeling changes over time, and labels have different meaning to different people. So I think that's another thing that I might throw back to the table. What do labels mean?
Yeah, I think those were two very interesting points. The first one, the question of who creates the character, and the second one about assumptions of labeling and whether there's a sort of catch-22 to it, where we, maybe behave in a way that we think is expected, and then that perpetuates the same model, I guess. But also picking up on the same from your conversations at the roundtable before, the same point about even the duality of the term invisible, which I think kind of Maia explored as well, the notion that it can be, I guess, both positive and negative. In your case, the kind of anonymity of being lumped in with other people and having a kind of broad categorization of a group that leaves out the individual. But in the case of Maia and workplace organizing, or the work that we do as SAW as a collective, and the power of anonymity and invisibility in it, which maybe allows you or empowers you to act a certain way because you have the kind of power of the group behind you. So I think, the two linked in quite nicely.
I think the difference there is choice, though. It's like whether you're choosing to be invisible or it's being like put on you and the characters. And that's like the point that you're making, that if it's something which is like forced on you or decided by someone else, or is it something that you decide or your group decides? And that's the kind of, I think there's like a difference in power in those things, and why it can be like empowering or not if it's a choice that you make and you make with other people, or it's something that's put on you maybe more as an individual, and like maybe that's the difference between, an important difference between those things.
Yeah, and back to the point of labeling this, the workplace organizing exercise that we printed out, that maybe not enough copies of, but they're basically, it contains descriptions of the main characters, let's say, that would be in an architectural office. And you can identify, so that you can identify the one that you should speak to first in order to organize. So again, there's no kind of moral dimension to it, which is something that I found surprising when I first done the exercise. You don't necessarily look for the person that has the same values, but you might look for the person who is most likely to turn or has the most influence to other people. But it's interesting that, I guess, what allowed us to arrive at these characters is the fact that they are sort of ubiquitous in architectural practices. And that, in one way or another, people from a practice would fall into one of those, which makes it quite universal.
And perhaps here, just because, on the first provocation, we have this idea of role. But at the end of the day, I think, it's closer attached, and it will be more accurate to talk about positions instead. Because, by taking a stance, choosing, it gives this, taking a position, it's quite political, without specifically, giving it this kind of modern idea of being political, but a more contemporary one, meaning that, at the same time, you actually find your own agency. You are in a position that you can give this agency back to those people, or, to these actants who do not have, but at the same time, you are assuming a responsibility. And of course, this goes back, to this kind of more ethical question of how you can either give voice or, if you choose to remain, invisible, still, it's a political action, at the end of the day. If you took this kind of position and you're pretty much aware of it, and it's your own personal choice. So perhaps, instead of talking about roles, it will be, it is about time to talk more about positions, and the position of the architect, for example, the position of, the member of the community, the position that I have in this table in order to bring, to the discussion, these kinds of opinions that I have, and perhaps to bring also the thoughts that usually, as you said, remain, I need to leave them, on the back before entering this discussion.
That's interesting. I guess it brings in the notion of responsibility as maybe as a representative of a group that embodies certain characteristics, but also ties in well with what Reham was saying in the context of professional splitting. As you said, you're inhabiting a position. The position might be of the architect, but then you might also be a mother. And the kind of choice, the act of choice that might have repercussions because of certain expectations that are already in the room, let's say. The choice that you take in showing up as one or the other. And I guess, that was one of the Reham's provocations, actually, was what do we perceive as barriers? For example, in terms of physical barriers to the room, I guess it's the room arrangement, the fact that we have, I guess when we imagine reshaping the table, we would have ideally had a long table in the room that everyone could sit at. So we'd come from, in physical terms or in spatial terms, on equal footing. But I guess, the question is, what does this setup do to our dynamic and to conversation? I guess we're still split. Some of us are at the table, predominantly the people who are speaking, and then we still have an audience. I guess that's a physical barrier.
I just wanted to bring in an example that I thought was quite funny about this. Labeling yourself, but also taking a position. There's this band called Accident. They're not called. They say we're accidental women, and I thought it's very interesting because you're sort of you're telling to the outside world expects you to describe yourself, right, in a certain term that they understand, but their identity clearly they feel that it's sort of accidental, that it's not sort of they're defining them. And I thought it's very interesting to sort of present yourself like that, to make actually a further statement than saying I'm a woman. I just wanted to share.
I guess then we're kind of on to another distinction of character, which is between those that you are born into and that are placed upon you, and the ones that you choose or you grow into, like a profession, for example.
Yes.
You will become an architect, but you are born as a woman and you are faced with the kind of limitations that society places upon you. I think if anyone wants to add something, just put your hand up and we'll get a mic here. It doesn't need to be a kind of fully formed thought or anything like that. It can just be, a short sentence or a question even.
Is that working? Yeah? Yeah. I thought it was funny there's a hole in the table. I'm like, maybe there's someone missing. I don't know. But I think if we think about the spatiality of what we're trying to do, and having a seat at the table, but there's a hole in the table just felt quite funny. And I enjoyed Jordan's phrase about seat at the table is not being the same as being displayed at the table. And I think that's also interesting when you look at kind of the dynamic of a table, because what about, and sort of intersecting this thought with like, what parts of yourself do you leave behind before taking a seat at the table? But then there might be pieces that I'm not bringing here that I choose not to present today. But maybe a discussion might bring those parts of me to the table. It's like everyone is a table themselves, and we all have seats, and we choose which seats we're going to put into the table before we slot ourselves into the table. And I think it's interesting, where do we choose to leave some of the seats out, and where are we choosing not to, and where don't you have a choice? And I think sometimes choice is seen as, I don't know what the phrase would be. choice is seen as a choice, but actually for sort of more hidden parts of yourself, they can be brought to the table without your choice through the dynamic of the table, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So I guess shedding layers of yourself is sometimes a prerequisite to you having a seat at the table. And I think my favorite quote of the day, which is "Everyone is a table." I really love that. Anyone else have any not fully formed thoughts? Sorry for making intense eye contact with some of you. I am trying to put you on the spot deliberately. And it worked.
I don't have a fully formed question, but I wanted to just to put a word out there which kind of comes. I heard it many times today. It's the storytelling. Because going back to the question, I think Reham posed at the beginning, who would like to enter in conversation with, which of course posed the question, who is to speak, who is to listen and speak back to us. And being within an academic context, right, and all of us, we are architects, but also research, reread the stories. I want to just ask how you see the role of forming and telling stories instead of history or histories.
Was that a question directed at Reham? I think that ties in quite well with what Jordan was saying about the necessary steps that need to be taken for the future to take place. And perhaps, as you said, maybe storytelling is a way of rewriting narratives.
Yeah. Yes. I think storytelling is interesting. So we use the collective that I run, we've used storytelling to kind of enable disabled people who aren't necessarily within architecture to be able to talk about their spaces. Which I think is a very important thing, is to be able to re-inhabit space, and arguably we can feel it sometimes in stronger ways, because we have to be more aware of certain features or qualities of space which impact us. So therefore, there's a way of telling those stories which enables not only other people to understand those, but for us to reflect upon them ourselves, which I think is really important. But when we're talking about the invisible, there's also the stories that space can tell itself, and those aren't necessarily explicit. They're kind of stories you have to tease out or excavate. This building is one itself, really. I'm sure it's got many stories. But sort of my work about it has looked at, as I said, Andrew Walker, who was a disabled tutor here, who could only inhabit while he was here and after he became disabled, one single room in the back of the building and accessed by the back of the building. So his story was one that I was interested in, not just because I saw myself in the story, which I think is also an interesting thing to think about, is how when you hear a story, you see yourself reflected in it, or you can empathize with it, or you can understand it, which maybe is a good framing of a story. But it also enabled a history which had generally been forgotten, apart from those who it immediately impacted, to be brought into the present. And your original question was about the future. So I think it's quite interesting how we can use stories to actually contemplate the future. And I said in the text about how we need to look ahead and how we often forget what we've learned from the past. Case in point, there used to be a ramp out the front of the building that Andrew used to use. It was then scrapped. And then there was another ramp built for a visitor to come and lecture here. That was scrapped. And then there's another set of ramps out there and maybe that would be scrapped soon. But I think trying to move towards a point where we're not forgetting those histories and they're becoming not just present, but have a longevity to them. I think that's sort of a point we need to get to. And I was thinking about this earlier when you mentioned the sort of the institutions in Ireland, about how one of my questions that I didn't get to ask was whether those institutions are still there and what state they still exist in, right? How much have they changed? How much have they changed on the surface? How much have they changed beneath the surface? Because often with those kind of institutional veils, that there's a kind of perception externally of change, but not internally. I don't know that answers your question whatsoever, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it wasn't a question.
Does that work?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I kind of just was thinking, as you're saying, I always find it kind of difficult with the whole histories, narratives, and I'm a part of this, like recording women's histories has been the small segment of work that I've done, and it's been interesting, but I feel like I'm like, is this enough? And I do feel that we each have a responsibility to write our own histories, which is something that obviously isn't new, but the people who are very comfortable with their seats at the table do it themselves. And I think we have to do it. And even pointing out the steps we've made to create a more equitable, accessible workplace is worthy. Like, even if I do a talk and I post it on Instagram, I'll be like, I was paid for this. You know, it's like pointing out that you don't just give up your time for free, because I don't have the privilege to do so. And kind of, I don't know, kind of rewriting this narrative that it wasn't like easy for Jordan to be here today because it took 10 people to get you in the door. In a way, I'm like, we shouldn't have to record it. But in another way, I'm like, this is what happened. I had to fight for 2 months to get paid for this. And I just think there's something there where if you're doing the work to make this more equal table, then record that as well. And not leaving it for someone to invite you to be recorded or to record someone else's history, but to record your own steps. And I think that feels really arrogant, but it's very needed.
So to kind of to take control of the story.
Yeah, and oh my gosh, now I'm going to hash it. What's her name? The woman architect. No. This is embarrassing for me. Come back to me.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Oh, you want to go? You should.
Okay, I'll say something quickly. But yeah, on your point about telling stories, and I think that was what Sarah said about it's something that we've used in the union about recording our own stories, and it was how we started to come together. And it wasn't that when the union started, there was a workers' inquiry, which was about recording the sector from the bottom up and looking at historical examples of attempts to unionize and sort of worldly examples, and then also what was happening now to students and to workers in the profession, and by people sort of sharing their stories and finding like common ground in those stories, and maybe being able to identify themselves in other people's stories when people don't always feel confident and empowered to share their own, and having those collected ourselves like really helped to set out what the union's sort of intentions were, the things that we were trying to address by kind of collecting all of these people's stories. I think that was a really important part in the start of being able to work together, having an understanding of what's happened so you can decide how to move forward. That's probably an obvious thing to say, but I think the storytelling was a really important part of everyone coming together to start the work.
I think that's to add to that, I think that's a really good example of a kind of an example of a collective issue that we all had as architectural workers, but the need to individualize it and to make the invisible visible as an individual for others to be able to relate to it. I think. Sorry,
okay, I've got what I was going for. Very embarrassing. Minette de Silva made her own sort of autobiography of her work, and to be fair, a lot of her buildings are still falling into disrepair and no one cares, but it was a political statement in itself to do such a thing. And so I think we should repair her buildings and keep them alive like Le Corbusier's, as in as important as, not as his. And two, I think it's a really good example of taking control of your own narrative.
Did you have a point, Resham, as well?
I did, but I'm just like mulling over what Sarah was saying.
That's okay. I think some very interesting things have been said. I think starting with Jordan, of the story that the space tells itself, the idea that a lot of these barriers are visible and they are ingrained in our built environment. Then I guess, building on from what Maia was saying as well, the stories as a springboard for dreaming, and maybe hearing the story, again, to what Jordan was saying about the tutor who was able to access the building, hearing the story of someone else who has perhaps been able to switch character, giving you the capacity to imagine that for yourself. And then the notion of temporary versus permanent switch, and in the context of women's rights, let's say, and the idea that this can be, or having access to the table, the idea that this can be at any point reversed, which is something that we're seeing at the moment. And yeah, the kind of maybe necessity to solidify each step as we progress to something that is more equitable.
Can I jump in? I'm not sure
Yes.
who's got their hands up because I can't see everyone. I'm really glad we arrived at that storytelling kind of place, because I'm thinking of multiple things, but the kind of strong thread that is in my mind is meaning making, which is another step from storytelling, right? So we've moved from history, then there's the story, there's the individual story, there's collective story, but there's meaning making, which is actually what allows us to think and envision our future, which is circling back, I suppose, to, I think the three of us mentioned are interested in how to imagine and make space for different possibilities in the future. And so I'm just putting it in there as, what meaning do we make out of our stories, and what kind of tools and methods and spaces do we have to, because meaning making is really challenging. It's one thing to ask, tell your story, which is got its own challenges, and like has been mentioned already, maybe some stories are a lot more challenging to arrive to, and kind of tangled in pain and trauma, whereas others kind of, are more easily narrated. But then the meaning you make out of all of that, I think, is what helps us, move forward. I don't know what, others think. Thoughts on this?
Can you explain what you mean by meme making?
Meaning making. So making meaning. So what did this mean? What did that story mean?
Oh, okay. I misunderstood.
In my, like what does this mean for me? Whether we are, I'm thinking of the town centre, for example, in Croydon. So what does this mean for the future of the town centre? That this is the story. Does it mean that that there's a really helpful framework for this, again, back in the kind of psychology realm, but there's a framework called PTMF, Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is which helps us kind of move beyond the individual and a little bit more kind of politicize our difficult stories, so that they part of it is PTMF stands for power, threat, meaning. So it's about identifying what power is and what kind of tensions and power dynamics played out in that story, and where you place yourself within that, so that you're able to make a meaning out of it and then move forward or continue the story.
Yeah, I think that sounds quite similar. I was wondering if you would be able to speak a bit more to explain the game developed for the urban room. So the Croydon Urban Room is a sort of long-term space for engagement, is run by Croydon Council, and is meant to kind of host a variety of actants, let's say, and collectively imagine a future for the town centre. And then as a kind of tool to do that, Reham has developed a game that is employing some of the character cards and archetypes that she was speaking about. And then it made me, the kind of identifying individual powers point that you just made me think of that. I was just wondering if you could explain how that works, or explain the kind of process of the game, the kind of character building.
Yeah, I suppose I touched on it a little bit in my little talk earlier, but I think maybe the power scoring thing maybe is an interesting thread, because so it's kind of getting you to think of, so there's 3 layers of character building, and the first layer is your kind of like more easily accessible kind of, so I'm a resident, or I'm an artist, or whoever you are on the table in that sense. And then the second layer is perhaps a little bit of a personal note. So whether you're, like we're talking about being a mother, or, as a person of color, or, whatever is that kind of second layer. And then the third layer is the archetype. And then we ask participants to start looking at a chart of power scoring. So what kind of powers do you think you hold as part of this conversation? And of course, it's contextual and relational as well. It depends on who else is on the table. And so we're thinking, what kind of economic power do you have as part of this conversation? What kind of, we've inserted a few more categories, like ecological power, if you happen to be, if you enter the conversation as something more creative, or like we had someone who's entering as a pigeon once. So if you have ecological power as part of being a pigeon, and the political power, of course, and so it's again adding to this. I suppose that's entering a story making and building, right? So you're building that world together now. So it's always going to be relational. There's power dynamics that will always come and play. And I suppose the point that I'm really interested in is then what, because we tend to get stuck in these, it's great that we can have these conversations and, like we can tell our stories, and it's so important. But where we're really stuck, I find, is how to facilitate space and really give enough time and space for imaginings, future imaginings and alternatives to actually emerge from that place, from these more authentic kind of truthful stories.
Yeah, I guess ultimately it's how we transfer real power rather than imagined power onto the residents in the context of public engagement. But I think, that links quite well to what we were just saying about kind of conditions shifting temporarily. The fact that as a kind of exercise of imagination, you're allowed as a resident through this game to temporarily inhabit a different character, which in a sense might teach you empathy as well, because you're kind of trying to see certain issues through the lens of someone else, but then also helps you imagine what might be possible for you to do had you not been limited by your kind of day-to-day characteristics. How are we doing for time? We should wrap it up, but if there are any final remarks, especially from the sides of the room, they would be very welcome. But it's okay if not.
It also make me realize also all the label that we put, because when we do research, and we were talking this morning also about archives, it's also the way we look at archives, because we have our own understanding with our own culture, our own boundaries, so we have to know that also. So I guess asking ourselves who we are in the three layers is really important before looking at an archive, and what type of label we are putting on people from the past. And you were saying something really interesting, is that sometimes invisibility is also a choice and strength. And in my research, I look at commoning and collective practices. And yes, I was trying to trace it as, they should be visible, but it's also their choices to be invisible. And you made me realize that, so thank you. And also now I'm asking myself, what is my responsibility in that? Because they're also choosing not to be actually individuals. So how should I actually go talk to them, or even now, should I label them, and how?
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, that's an interesting point from the lens of research, of the not so objective observer, and kind of having to be very conscious of who you show up as, and have that as a reference point. Whenever you're looking at other people's stories.
It made me think of the ethics around what you were mentioning earlier, around the photographer who went to these institutions over 30 years, and his role in photographing, documenting patient staff there. And I don't know if anyone knows it, but Diane Arbus, who's a photographer, photographed famously patients from institutions, often with their consent, but sometimes not. And it's just really interesting, like you say, about how that the ethics of choice is also really important. And when you're in particular institutions, how much choice do you have? And I think that comes back to a point we made earlier. So, that's it.
Cool, thank you. I think we're going to wrap up. Hopefully everyone leaves with a few more questions. Thanks.
Okay.